Well, here we go. Just two more minor prophets to finish the book of the 12. This week we're going to be looking at Zechariah, in essence a major minor prophet, just simply due to the length of the book. And then we're going to look at Malachi as we wrap things up. By way of advertisement, let me give you a heads up that what we'll do next week and maybe part of the following week is look at what I'm going to call the what ifs. Not really what ifs, but if, when. We're going to look at some things Jesus expects us to do when we're Christians. And we're going to talk about what it means if we don't do those things. And we'll be drawing most of that from the book of Matthew, specifically chapter 6, as part of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. But that's next week. Back to Zechariah this week. Zechariah is an interesting prophet. His name literally means God remembers. He comes from a priestly line. He's got a long story to tell in a very short amount of space, if you will, in that, he, like others during the time period in which he writes his book, he was born during the exile when the people of Judah were in captivity in Babylon. He's alive after King Cyrus has freed the captives, those who want to go home, who have been allowed to return to Jerusalem. And he's writing about the same time period as the book of Haggai, as well as Ezra and Nehemiah. In fact, we know that Zechariah is writing exactly 2 months after the book of Haggai. And so think about the context from that book last week. It's 2 months later. They've returned from the exile. Haggai has challenged them to get busy rebuilding the temple, and they finally have. If you remember from Haggai, they got the temple rebuilt, or at least a foundation, and they were brokenhearted because it was clearly going to be much smaller, much more diminished building than what they were used to under the old days of Solomon's temple. And they equated that with the decrease of God's blessing for the people. And so Haggai encouraged them that our hope, their hope specifically, isn't based on the building, but on the building's representative nature pointing us to God. Here's Zechariah coming along, trying to also address the issue of things aren't quite right, while looking at it from the perspective of spiritual matters. He offers for us 8 visions and 4 different messages, and beyond that, also 2 burdens or 2 oracles. But through it all, there's really one theme in the book of Zechariah, and that is our hope is God's Messiah, the one that he's sending to us, what he'll do and what will be accomplished through him. And so rather than going through the whole book, it's a longer book, I want to call your attention to a couple key passages that speak directly to the Messiah and his ministry here on earth, both in the first incarnation as well as the second coming. So skip over several chapters and find your way to chapter 6. Once you've found your way there, let's go ahead and begin there at verse 9. It says, Then the word of the Lord came to me, Take from the exiles Heldiah, Tobiah, Jedaiah, who have arrived from Babylon, and go in the same day to the house of Josiah, the son of Zephaniah. Take from them silver and gold, and make a crown, and set it on the head of Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Keep reading if you'd like, all the way down through verse 15. But what I want to point out is this Joshua, this high priest, becomes symbolic. He becomes representative. He becomes a type of the coming Messiah. Now remember, the name Joshua literally means the Lord saves, and it's the name Jesus would have received as a Hebrew child. Jesus is the Greek name. Joshua would have been his Jewish name. And so here this high priest, during the time period of Zechariah, is an indicator, a foreshadowing of the coming Messiah. But notice, here with him, they're to take the gold and the silver and make him a crown. Now, we know that Aaron and other high priests wore a crown, so that's not entirely foreign. But think common sense, big idea, what do we typically think of when we think of a crown? We think of a king. And so here we have a picture that one day the Messiah is going to be, yes, a high priest. Verse 11 says that, but also a king. In fact, it's later mentioned that he's going to be the branch. Language first found in the book of Isaiah, pointing to one who's a descendant of David. So as the son of David, just as Solomon had done once before, the coming Messiah is a son of David in that kingly line who will rebuild God's temple. That points, by the way, back to the prophecies earlier in the books of Samuel and Kings that The promise that David's son would build a temple was not limited to Solomon and his temple, but the coming Messiah who would be a descendant of David, who would build once and for all, forever, God's house, God's people. So he'll be a king, he'll be a priest, and we must then therefore respond in faith. And this shall come to pass, it says in verse 15, if you diligently obey the voice of the Lord your God. We've got to believe his word. We've got to respond to his word. We've got to obey his word. And so the first picture, of course, here we get is that the Messiah is going to solve the problem that the people have. They need a king. They need access to God. The Messiah is going to do both. Now, go ahead and find your way to chapter 9. Zechariah reveals more about the Messiah here. The Messiah, he says, beginning in verse 9 and runs all the way into chapter 10, so it's too long for us to read here at length. He's going to come to do two things: to rule over his people and to rescue them. Remember, they're back from exile. Life, it turns out, isn't much better there than it was back in Babylon. And the prospects for a bright future aren't very bright at the moment. And the people are disappointed. And so Zechariah is sent by God to tell them his promises are great and the future is better than their present. So how do we recognize this Messiah who's going to bring all this about? Verse 9, chapter 9, verse 9. Some of you will recognize this one. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. Righteous and having salvation is he. Humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. And so the first coming of the king, the Messiah, is going to be marked by humility. He's a king bringing salvation, but he's going to come humble, mounted on a donkey, not on a white stallion, not on some great charger or horse, coming on the foal of a donkey. Of course, you know this is fulfilled in the New Testament on what we call the triumphal entry on Palm Sunday. When Jesus arrives, the people are shouting Hosanna to the king. The disciples put him on a donkey and they lead him into town, triumphantly taking and claiming the city of Jerusalem for God, but doing so in a very humble, in one sense, if it wasn't for the crowd, understated way. But not only is he coming with humility, if we look down at chapter 10, he's also coming to bring mercy. We could look at all of chapter 10, verses 6 through 12, but I want to call your attention to a couple of things as we go through there. Look, for example, at verse 6. It says, I will strengthen the house of Judah, and I will save the house of Joseph. So all of Israel will be brought in. Verse 8, I will whistle for them and gather them in, for I have redeemed them. He's going to rescue them and bring them to himself. And that victory, that blessing of salvation is going to be universal for his people. And all we have to do is respond and walk in faith. I will make them strong in the Lord, it says in verse 12, and they shall walk in his name. And so he's coming humble, and yet coming in a mighty, powerful way to rescue his people. Likewise, if we would go on and look at chapters 12 and part of chapter 13, the Messiah's sacrifice, the unexpected, the sacrifice of the Messiah, the death of the king, is actually what is our hope for salvation. And so he begins in chapter 12 with an oracle. A burden is literally what an oracle is. There's a heavy load of grief and burden to be borne with the coming of the Messiah. Now, if you look at verse 10 in chapter 12, it says that the Messiah, the king, is going to appear to his own first. And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me, on whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him. They're going to see him, they're going to recognize him, they're going to kill him, and then they're going to lament over it. And so he's going to appear to his own, who are going to pierce him. If you go on down to chapter 13, verses 7 and 8, it becomes even more graphic. Verse 7 of chapter 13, awake, O sword, against my shepherd, against the man who stands next to me, declares the Lord of hosts. Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. I will turn my hand against the little ones. Remember, Jesus warned his disciples, when they strike me, you'll all be scattered. In the whole land, declares the Lord, 2/3 shall be cut off and perish, and 1/3 shall be left alive. And so he's going to appear to his own, they're going to kill him, and he's going to be, in that sense, dying for his own. And what's required of us? to call out on his name. Look at verse 9 of chapter 13. They will call upon my name, it says in the beginning of the middle there, and I will answer them. And I will say, they are my people. And they will say, the Lord is my God. And so the Messiah is going to come, suffer, die a substitutionary death, and all we've got to do is call out on his name, and God will make us his people. Chapter 14 then describes the second coming, when he'll come back and he'll reign. It'll be universal. It'll be global. If you look at chapter 14, verse 9, the Lord will be king over all the earth. The Lord will be one, and his name one. He will be uniting all of it under the name of the one Lord our God. And not only will it be total, it'll be final. It'll be declared that it is holy to the Lord, completely dedicated to the King, to the Messiah. So much so that every pot in Jerusalem and Judah will be made holy to the hosts, so that all who sacrifice may come and take of it and boil the meat. And there shall no longer be any traitors in the house of the Lord of hosts. In other words, the house will be cleared. The temple will be cleansed. Recognize that story from the New Testament. All when the Messiah comes. He'll come. He'll unite the world. It'll be one final opportunity to come serve the King. And those who do will come and worship. As we read the prophets, they're not telling us just what happened in the past. They're telling us what was going to happen and how we're to respond. Zechariah is a message about the Messiah. When he came, Jesus told them, many of them didn't recognize him, and then they did exactly what he predicted, proving that he's the king. The question is now, what are you going to do with him? Will you bow down and worship him, or will you keep looking for a substitute?